They say the forest keeps secrets. I used to think that was just poetic nonsense, the kind of thing city people say when they want nature to sound mysterious and profound. I taught wilderness survival for 12 years before everything changed. I thought I knew everything about the woods. I thought I understood the dangers, the rhythms, the way nature operates according to predictable patterns. I was wrong about all of it. My name is Lucen. I am 34 years old, and what happened in the Cascade Wilderness last October shattered everything I believed about the world we live in. Some experiences cannot be explained away with logic. Some things cannot be rationalized by science or dismissed as tricks of perception. And some places in the wilderness should never be entered, no matter how experienced you think you are, no matter how well prepared, no matter how confident. This is the story of how I learned that lesson, and what it cost me to survive what I encountered in those dark woods. Before I tell you what happened out there, I need you to understand that every single word of this is true. I am not trying to entertain you with fiction. I am not creating content for views or engagement. I am sharing this because people desperately need to understand that there are places in the wilderness where normal reality does not apply. Places where something else exists, something ancient and patient, something that has been waiting in the shadows since long before humans ever walked beneath these trees. If you have ever felt watched while alone in the woods, if you have ever heard sounds that made absolutely no logical sense, if you have ever experienced moments where time seemed to slip and fold in ways that should not be physically possible, then you already know what I am talking about. You have felt it too. Leave a comment below and tell me your story. Tell me about the strange things you have experienced in remote places. I read every single comment, and maybe together we can start to understand what is really happening out there in the places humans rarely go. It was a Tuesday morning in late October when they arrived at the training center. The air carried that distinctive bite of autumn in the Pacific Northwest, sharp and clean, the kind of cold that makes your breath visible and turns your fingertips numb if you are not wearing gloves. The leaves on the deciduous trees had turned brilliant shades of gold and crimson, and they rustled in the morning breeze with a sound like whispered conversations. I was standing outside the Cascade Wilderness Training Center, watching the parking lot as my newest group arrived in their various vehicles. Some came in rental cars, clearly from out of state. Others drove pickup trucks with local plates, probably from Seattle or Portland. 6 people total, all adults, all convinced they needed to learn survival skills for various personal reasons. I had been teaching wilderness survival for 12 years at that point. Hundreds of groups had passed through my courses. The routine was always essentially the same: 3 days and 2 nights in the backcountry, learning the fundamental skills that keep people alive when modern conveniences are stripped away. Fire building without matches or lighters, shelter construction using only natural materials, water purification techniques, navigation using the sun, stars, and basic compass work, plant identification for foraging, basic first aid for wilderness injuries. Most groups handled the experience well. They learned their skills, pushed through some discomfort, discovered inner reserves of strength they did not know they possessed, and went home with stories about conquering nature and finding themselves. They posted photos on social media, updated their dating profiles with mentions of outdoor adventures, and generally felt proud of what they had accomplished. But every once in a while, maybe one group out of every 20 or 30, something would go wrong. Not wrong in the usual ways like sprained ankles or equipment failures or people quitting, because they could not handle being away from their phones. Wrong in ways that made my skin crawl and my deepest instincts scream to get everyone out immediately, to abandon the training and run back to civilization as fast as possible. This was going to be one of those times. I could feel it in my bones before we even left the parking lot, though I could not have explained why. There was something about this particular group, or maybe something about the timing, the season, the alignment of circumstances that I did not fully understand. Something felt off from the very beginning. The first person I met was Sarah, a 48-year-old accountant from Portland. She had recently gone through a difficult divorce after 23 years of marriage, and she wanted to prove to herself that she could handle being completely alone, that she did not need anyone else to feel safe or capable. She was thin and nervous, constantly adjusting her backpack straps and checking to make sure she had packed everything on the equipment list I had sent out 2 weeks earlier. Then came Marcus and Jennifer, a couple in their mid-30s who spent most of their weekends hiking the trails around Mount Hood and the Columbia River Gorge. They wanted to take their outdoor skills to the next level, to move beyond day hikes and car camping into true backcountry wilderness experience. They seemed confident and well-prepared, with expensive gear and the kind of physical fitness that comes from regular outdoor activity. Next was David, a 23-year-old recent college graduate who was trying to figure out his direction in life. He had majored in business but hated the corporate internships he had done. He thought that maybe learning to survive in the wilderness would give him some clarity, some perspective on what really mattered. He was enthusiastic but clearly inexperienced, the kind of person who had watched a lot of survival shows on television, but had never actually spent a night sleeping on the ground. Then there was Amanda, a photographer around 40 years old who specialized in wilderness landscape work. Her portfolio included stunning images from national parks across the western United States. She wanted to push deeper into remote locations for her photography, places where most people never went, and she needed the survival skills to do that safely. She carried 3 cameras and seemed to view everything through the lens of potential compositions. Finally, there was Eric, a quiet man in his late 50s who said very little about why he was there. He had signed up for the course 6 months in advance, paid in full immediately, and provided only the bare minimum information on his registration form. When I asked him during the check-in process what had motivated him to take wilderness survival training, he just smiled slightly and said he felt called to the forest. Something about the way he said it made me uncomfortable, though I could not pinpoint exactly why. "Welcome to Cascade Wilderness Training," I told them once everyone had gathered in the main building. "For the next 3 days, you are going to learn what it really means to be alone in nature. Not the romanticized Instagram version where everything is beautiful and peaceful. Not the sanitized camping experience where you are never more than a short walk from your car. The real thing. The version where comfort is earned through knowledge and effort, where safety is not guaranteed, and where survival depends entirely on your skills and decision-making." Sarah raised her hand nervously like a student in a classroom. "Is it actually dangerous? I mean, should we be worried about bears or mountain lions? I have read that attacks are rare, but they do happen." "There are dangers," I said carefully, choosing my words with precision. "But in my experience, the animals are usually the least of your concerns. Black bears are mostly curious and easily scared away. Cougars are so elusive that most people spend their entire lives hiking in cougar country without ever seeing one. The real challenge in wilderness survival is learning to trust yourself when everything feels uncertain, when you are completely removed from the modern safety nets you have depended on your entire life." I did not elaborate further. There was no point in trying to explain the other things I had encountered over 12 years of guiding groups into remote wilderness areas. The strange occurrences that happened in certain places where the forest felt different, heavier, like the air itself was conscious and watching you. The locations where sounds did not behave according to normal physics, where time seemed to move at inconsistent rates, where people reported seeing things that could not possibly exist. Most people would not believe those stories anyway, not until they experienced something similar themselves. And even then, most would rationalize it away, convince themselves it was just fatigue or fear or tricks of perception. We spent the morning going over equipment checks and basic safety protocols. I examined everyone's packs, making sure they had appropriate clothing layers, emergency supplies, water containers, and basic first aid kits. I confiscated cell phones and GPS devices, as I always did on these courses. Compasses and paper maps only. This policy always generated complaints from people who felt anxious about being disconnected from the digital world, but I was absolutely firm about it. There were reasons for keeping modern electronic technology out of certain wilderness areas, though I could never fully explain those reasons without sounding completely insane. Electronics behaved strangely in some locations. Batteries would drain impossibly fast. GPS coordinates would jump around randomly, showing positions that were miles from where you actually stood. Cell phones would pick up signals in places where there were no towers for 50 miles in any direction. Cameras would malfunction, producing images filled with strange distortions and artifacts. It was better to simply remove the technology entirely and rely on older methods of navigation and communication. By early afternoon, we were loaded into my truck and driving toward the Whispering Pines trailhead. The drive took about 90 minutes, following paved roads that gradually transitioned to gravel, then finally to a rough dirt track that required four-wheel drive. The landscape changed as we climbed higher into the mountains. The mixed forests of the lower elevations gave way to dense stands of old-growth evergreens, trees that had been standing for hundreds of years, long before this area had been designated as protected wilderness. "This place feels remote," Jennifer observed, looking out the window at the endless forest passing by. "How far are we from the nearest town?" "About 40 miles as the crow flies," I told her. "But there are no direct roads. If you had to hike out for an emergency, you would be looking at 2 or 3 days of hard travel through very challenging terrain." "That is exciting," Marcus said, grinning. "This is exactly what we were hopping for, true wilderness experience far from civilization." I said nothing. Remote was good for learning survival skills, but remote also meant that help was very far away if something went seriously wrong. And in places like the Whispering Pines, things had a tendency to go wrong in ways that normal emergency protocols could not address. We reached the trailhead at 2:30 p.m. The parking area was small and empty, just a gravel turnout barely large enough for 3 vehicles. A weathered wooden sign marked the beginning of the trail, Whispering Pines Loop 12 miles difficult. Below that was a smaller sign warning about bear activity and reminding hikers to practice leave no trace principles. What the sign did not mention were the other warnings, the ones that existed in local folklore and indigenous oral traditions, the stories about people who had vanished in this area over the decades, experienced outdoorsmen who had simply never returned from their hikes. The reports from earlier eras about strange lights moving through the forest at night, about voices calling from the darkness in languages no one could identify, about feelings of overwhelming dread that would suddenly descend on hikers for no apparent reason. I had researched the history of this area thoroughly before ever bringing groups here. The indigenous people who had lived in this region for thousands of years before European colonization had specific names for this forest, names that translated roughly to the place where spirits walk, or the threshold between worlds. They had stories about shamans who would come here to communicate with entities that existed beyond normal human perception. And they had strict cultural prohibitions about entering certain parts of the forest, especially during particular times of year. Modern rationalists dismissed all of this as superstition and folklore, but I had seen enough strange things over 12 years to know that sometimes the old stories contained important truths. "Everyone ready?" I asked, shouldering my pack and checking that everyone had their water bottles accessible. They all nodded, eager to begin. David was practically bouncing with nervous energy. Amanda already had one of her cameras out, taking photographs of the trailhead sign and the forest beyond. Eric stood slightly apart from the group, staring into the trees with an expression that was difficult to read. Not quite peaceful, but not anxious either. More like anticipation. We started hiking at 2:45 p.m. The trail was well maintained for the first mile or so. A clear path about 3 feet wide with occasional wooden markers nailed to trees to help with navigation. The grade was moderate, climbing steadily but not steeply enough to cause real difficulty. Everyone in the group was fit enough to handle this pace comfortably. But as we went deeper into the forest, things began to change. The trail became less distinct, narrower with more obstacles. Fallen logs blocked the path, requiring us to climb over or detour around them. The underbrush grew thicker, branches reaching across the trail to catch at our clothing and packs. The canopy overhead became denser, blocking out more and more sunlight until we were walking through a perpetual twilight despite it being mid-afternoon. "This place feels weird," Amanda said after about 90 minutes of hiking. She had stopped to take a photograph of a particularly massive old-growth tree, its trunk at least 8 feet in diameter. "The light is all wrong. It is like we are underwater or in a dream. Everything has this strange quality that I cannot quite capture with my camera." She was more perceptive than most people. The whispering pines had always felt distinctly different to me, even after dozens of trips through this area. The quality of light was strange, greenish and diffuse, creating an atmosphere that felt surreal and slightly threatening. Sounds traveled oddly here. Sometimes you would hear something that seemed impossibly close, like a branch snapping right next to your ear, only to realize the sound had actually come from hundreds of yards away. Other times, you could not hear someone shouting from just 20 feet behind you, their voice somehow swallowed by the forest before it reached your ears. The forest had its own logic in places like this, its own rules that did not quite match the normal physical world. I had learned to accept this without fully understanding it, the way sailors in ancient times accepted that certain parts of the ocean were simply more dangerous than others, even if they could not explain why in scientific terms. "Stay close together," I reminded everyone, my voice carrying more urgency than I had intended. "It is very easy to lose sight of people in terrain like this. The forest can be disorienting, especially for those who are not experienced with navigation in dense woodland." We continued hiking in tighter formation. David stayed right behind me, clearly nervous about the deepening gloom and the oppressive feeling of the forest around us. Marcus and Jennifer walked together, holding hands whenever the trail was wide enough to allow it. Sarah kept checking her compass obsessively, as if worried we were somehow getting turned around despite following an obvious trail. Amanda continued taking photographs, though I noticed she was shooting much more frequently now, almost compulsively, as if trying to document something she sensed but could not quite see. Eric walked at the rear of the group, maintaining a steady pace and saying nothing. Several times when I looked back to count heads, I caught him tilting his head slightly, as if listening to something the rest of us could not hear. His expression remained calm, almost serene, completely at odds with the increasing tension I could feel radiating from everyone else. By 5:15 p.m., we reached the camping area I had used many times before. It was a relatively flat clearing, roughly circular, about 60 feet in diameter. The ground was carpeted with fallen pine needles, creating a soft surface that was relatively comfortable for sleeping. Massive evergreen trees surrounded the perimeter, their trunks easily 3 to 4 feet thick, their branches forming a dense canopy overhead. A small stream ran along the eastern edge of the clearing, providing fresh water that would need to be filtered, but was otherwise clean and cold. Perfect for teaching survival skills, or at least it had been perfect on previous trips. Today, something felt fundamentally different about the place. The clearing seemed darker than I remembered, even though the sun had not set yet. The stream sounded louder, almost angry, its burbling transformed into something more aggressive and chaotic. And the trees around the perimeter looked like they were leaning inward, crowding closer than they had been on previous visits, though I knew that was impossible. Trees did not move. I shook off the feeling and got everyone started on building shelters. This was one of the core skills I taught, how to construct a weatherproof shelter using only natural materials found in the forest. Branches for framing, pine boughs for insulation and waterproofing, leaves and moss for additional layering. Done correctly, a debris hut could keep you warm and dry even in freezing rain. Marcus and Jennifer worked together with impressive efficiency, constructing a solid shelter that would easily accommodate both of them. They had clearly done this before, or at least something similar. Their movements were coordinated, their design sensible and functional. Sarah struggled more, trying to build a shelter alone as a test of her independence. Her frame kept collapsing because she had not secured the main ridge pole properly. But she refused help, determined to figure it out herself. I appreciated her stubborn self-reliance, even if it meant her shelter took much longer to complete. David tried to build something overly elaborate, inspired by a survival show he had watched. He wanted a 2-story structure with a raised sleeping platform and an elaborate entrance. It collapsed repeatedly, and each failure made him more frustrated. Eventually, I intervened and helped him build something simpler that would actually keep him warm through the night. Amanda stopped building her shelter every few minutes to photograph the process and the forest around us. She seemed increasingly distracted, constantly looking around as if expecting to see something moving between the trees. Several times she raised her camera to photograph something, then lowered it again with a confused expression, as if whatever she had seen was no longer there. Eric worked alone in complete silence, moving with methodical precision. His shelter was architecturally perfect, with clean lines and excellent structural integrity. It looked like something designed by an engineer, not a first-time wilderness survival student. When I asked him about it, he gave me the same slight smile as before. "I have never been camping in my life," he said, "but this feels familiar somehow, like I have built shelters like this in dreams or in memories that are not quite my own." That should have been a clear warning sign. When people report feeling familiar with places they have never been, when they claim to have knowledge they should not possess, something is usually very wrong. But I was focused on getting everyone settled before darkness fell, and I did not pay enough attention to what Eric was actually saying. As the sun began to set around 6:30 p.m., I built a fire in the center of the clearing. Fire building is one of the most important wilderness survival skills, and I always demonstrated multiple methods. First, using a bow drill to create an ember through friction, then carefully nurturing that ember into flame. Then showing how to use a magnesium fire starter as a backup method. The group watched attentively, and several of them tried the bow drill themselves under my supervision. The fire grew steadily, crackling and popping as it consumed the dry wood I had gathered. The flames cast dancing shadows across the clearing, and the temperature dropped rapidly as full darkness approached. This was normally when I would give my standard speech about wilderness safety at night, staying near the fire for warmth and light, keeping your water bottle from freezing, being aware of nocturnal animals but not overly paranoid about them, hanging food away from the sleeping area to avoid attracting bears. But before I could begin my usual presentation, David stood up abruptly from where he had been sitting by the fire. His face was pale in the firelight, and he was staring intently toward the tree line on the western edge of the clearing. "What the hell is that?" he asked, his voice tight with fear. We all turned to look in the direction he was pointing. About 40 yards into the forest, just barely visible in the fading twilight, something pale was moving between the trees. It was there for just a moment, a vertical shape that seemed too tall to be human, moving with a strange flowing quality that did not match any animal I had ever encountered in 12 years of wilderness guiding. Then it was gone, vanished between one blink and the next, as if it had never existed at all. "Probably just a deer," I said automatically, though every instinct I possessed was screaming that it had not been a deer. They can look strange in dim light, especially when you are not used to seeing wildlife up close. "That was not a deer," Marcus said firmly, his voice carrying absolute conviction. I have been hunting since I was 12 years old. I know what deer look like. That was walking upright on two legs, and it was at least 7 feet tall. Jennifer pulled her jacket tighter around herself, wrapping her arms across her chest. Maybe it was another hiker, someone else camping in this area. There are no other groups scheduled for this section of forest, I told her, trying to keep my voice calm and reassuring. And it is too late in the season for random recreational hikers to be this deep in the wilderness. Most people stick to day hikes this time of year. Amanda had grabbed one of her cameras and was adjusting settings frantically, trying to capture something in the rapidly fading light. Did you see how it moved? It was not walking. It was more like gliding or floating, like it was not quite touching the ground. The group exchanged nervous glances. I could feel the mood shifting dramatically, from excited anticipation to genuine unease. The forest around us seemed to grow darker and more oppressive, pressing in closer. The normal sounds of evening in the woods, birds settling into their roosts, small mammals beginning their nocturnal activities, were completely absent. Everything was too quiet, as if the entire forest was holding its breath and waiting for something to happen. "Listen," I said, working to project confidence I did not entirely feel. "Strange things can happen in the wilderness, especially at night when your eyes are adjusting to darkness and shadows can play tricks on your perception. Sounds carry from unexpected directions because of how acoustic waves travel through dense forest. Your mind can make you see things that are not really there, filling in details based on your expectations and fears. The important thing is to stay calm and stay together. We have a good fire, solid shelters, and all the supplies we need. There is nothing in these woods that poses a real threat to a prepared group." But even as I spoke those words, I knew they were not entirely true. There were things in certain wilderness areas that could not be explained by normal science or rational analysis. Things that existed in the spaces between human understanding and primal instinct. I had encountered them before, though never quite this directly, never quite this early in a trip. We settled around the fire as full darkness descended at 7:45 p.m. The night came on quickly at this elevation and this time of year, the sun dropping below the mountain ridges and plunging the forest into complete blackness within minutes. The fire became our only source of light, a small island of warmth and visibility in an ocean of darkness. I assigned watch partners so no one would be alone during the night. Sarah and Amanda would take the first shift from 8 p.m. to 10 p.m., keeping the fire going and maintaining awareness of our surroundings. Marcus and Jennifer would cover 10 p.m. to midnight. David and Eric would handle midnight to 2 a.m. I would take the final shift alone from 2 a.m. until dawn, which I preferred because it allowed me to maintain control of the most vulnerable hours when human alertness is naturally at its lowest. "What exactly are we watching for?" Sarah asked nervously. "Anything unusual," I said. "Animals approaching the camp, changes in weather, someone getting up to use the bathroom and not returning promptly, the fire burning too low, just general awareness of our environment. Honestly, nothing will probably happen. These watches are more about practicing awareness and giving everyone experience with night duty than responding to actual threats." That was the standard answer I gave to all groups, but tonight, I suspected the watches might be more necessary than usual. Something about this place felt wrong in a way I had not experienced before, not even on the previous occasions when strange things had occurred. People began crawling into their shelters around 8:30 p.m. I listened to them settling in, the rustling of sleeping bags being arranged, the soft conversations between Marcus and Jennifer in their shared shelter, David's nervous muttering to himself as he tried to get comfortable. Within 30 minutes, most sounds had died down, leaving only the crackling of the fire and the whisper of the stream at the edge of the clearing. I retreated to my own shelter, a simple lean-to positioned where I could see most of the clearing. But sleep would not come, despite my exhaustion from the long day of hiking and teaching. My mind was too active, too alert to the wrongness of this place tonight. Every small sound seemed amplified and significant. The rustling of the fire sounded too rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat. The stream had changed its tone somehow. Its burbling transformed into something that almost resembled whispering voices, though I could not make out any actual words. And underneath everything was a deep humming, so low that I felt it more than heard it. A vibration that seemed to come from the ground itself, resonating through my body at a frequency that made my teeth ache and my chest feel tight. At 11:34 p.m., according to my watch, Amanda screamed. The sound shattered the quiet night like glass breaking. I was out of my shelter in seconds, my flashlight in one hand and my knife in the other. My heart was pounding, adrenaline flooding my system, every sense heightened to maximum alertness. The fire had burned down to dim coals, barely providing enough light to see across the clearing. Marcus was already out of his shelter, sweeping his flashlight beam back and forth across the tree line in rapid, jerky movements. Amanda sat by the fire pit, her whole body trembling violently, her arms wrapped around herself. "What happened?" I demanded, reaching her side and dropping to one knee. "Amanda, are you hurt?" "Something touched me," she said, her voice shaking so badly I could barely understand the words. "I was sitting here keeping watch like you said, feeding sticks to the fire, and something reached out from the darkness behind me and touched the back of my neck, like fingers but cold, so impossibly cold that it burned, ice cold but burning at the same time." Marcus kept his flashlight moving, searching the perimeter of the clearing. "I did not see anything. I heard her scream and came out immediately, but there is nothing here. No animal, no person, nothing." By this time, everyone else had emerged from their shelters. Jennifer stood close to Marcus, holding his arm. David looked genuinely terrified, his face pale and his eyes wide. Sarah was trying to maintain composure, but I could see her hands shaking. Only Eric seemed calm, standing at the edge of the circle of firelight with that same serene expression, as if whatever had just happened was expected somehow. I examined the back of Amanda's neck with my flashlight. There was no visible mark, no injury, no sign of any physical contact, but her skin was ice cold to the touch, far colder than it should have been given that she was sitting close to the fire. "Did you see what touched you?" I asked, keeping my voice calm and professional despite my own racing heartbeat. "No, I felt it, but I did not see anything. When I turned around, there was just darkness, empty space where something should have been standing." I looked around at the group, all of them frightened now, the reality of our isolation settling over them like a cold blanket. We were 10 miles into the wilderness. Even if we decided to leave right now, we would be hiking through complete darkness on difficult terrain for hours before reaching the trailhead. And whatever had touched Amanda might still be out there, watching us from the shadows. I made a decision. Everyone stays awake until dawn. No more watch shifts. We all stay by the fire together, keep it burning high, and wait for morning light. Then we will reassess the situation. "What about our shelters?" David asked. "Should we take them down?" "Leave them. If everyone is staying by the fire, we do not need them tonight. Gather your sleeping bags and bring them here. We will arrange ourselves in a circle around the fire pit." For the next several hours, we sat huddled together in the darkness. I kept the fire blazing, feeding it constantly with dead branches I had gathered earlier. The flames threw wild, dancing shadows across the clearing and into the surrounding forest. And in those shadows, we began to see things that should not exist. They appeared first as vague shapes at the very edge of visibility. Tall, thin forms that seemed almost human but moved with impossible smoothness, gliding between the trees rather than walking. They would materialize for just a moment in the space between two tree trunks, then vanish when you tried to focus on them directly, as if they existed only in peripheral vision. "There," Jennifer whispered, pointing toward the eastern edge of the clearing. "Did you see that? Something moved behind that big pine tree." We all stared in the direction she indicated, but there was nothing there now, just the tree trunk and the darkness beyond it. Then Marcus saw something to the west. Then Sarah to the north. The shapes were circling us, staying just beyond the reach of our firelight, appearing and disappearing in a pattern that felt deliberate and coordinated, like predators studying prey before deciding whether to attack. "This is not real," David said, his voice rising toward panic. "This cannot be real. There is a logical explanation. Shadows and firelight creating optical illusions, our minds filling in patterns that are not actually there." "Then why are we all seeing the same things?" Amanda asked quietly. "How can we all be having the same hallucinations?" That was the question that had no rational answer. Mass hallucinations were theoretically possible, usually triggered by environmental factors like carbon monoxide poisoning or consuming contaminated food or water. But we had not eaten anything unusual. We were in an outdoor setting with unlimited fresh air, and we had all been experiencing symptoms simultaneously from the moment we arrived at this clearing. At 1:47 a.m. by my watch, we started hearing the voices. They began as whispers, so faint I thought at first they might be the wind moving through the trees or the stream flowing over rocks, but gradually they grew louder and more distinct, and they were saying our names. Sarah, Marcus, Lucen. Each name spoken by multiple voices simultaneously, overlapping and echoing in ways that violated the normal physics of sound. The voices seemed to come from all directions at once, from the forest surrounding us, maybe even from the ground beneath us. Some sounded almost human, others were completely alien, tones and harmonics that human vocal cords could not produce. Amanda, Jennifer, David. The effect was profoundly disturbing, hearing your own name called from the darkness by something unknown. Every primitive instinct in the human brain is wired to respond when you hear your name. You want to answer, to identify yourself, to communicate with whoever is calling. But some deeper survival instinct warned against responding to these voices, as if answering would create a connection that could not be broken. David started crying, tears streaming down his face as he rocked back and forth. "I want to go home. Please, I just want to go home. This is insane. This cannot be happening." Amanda put her arm around him, trying to provide comfort even though she was clearly just as terrified. "We are okay. We are together. Nothing has actually hurt us. We just need to stay calm until morning." But I was not sure we were okay. Whatever was circling us in the darkness felt malevolent in a way I had never experienced before. Not the simple aggression of a predatory animal, but something far more complex and disturbing. These entities, whatever they were, felt intelligent. They felt curious. And they felt patient, as if they had all the time in the world to study us and decide what to do with us. Marcus and Jennifer sat pressed against each other, holding hands so tightly their knuckles were white. Jennifer was whispering prayers under her breath, fragments of religious phrases I could barely make out. Marcus stared into the fire with fixed intensity, as if looking anywhere else might shatter his grip on sanity. Sarah had stopped trying to maintain her composure. She sat with her knees pulled up to her chest, arms wrapped around her legs, rocking slightly and making small, whimpering sounds. The strong, independent woman who had wanted to prove she could handle being alone had been reduced to primal fear. Only Eric remained calm throughout all of this. He sat at the edge of our circle, facing outward toward the darkness, his expression peaceful and attentive. Several times I caught him tilting his head, listening intently to something the rest of us could not quite hear beneath the whispered names and the strange harmonics coming from the forest. "Eric," I said quietly, moving to sit beside him, "what are you hearing?" He did not turn to look at me, keeping his gaze fixed on the darkness beyond the firelight. "They are inviting us to join them, to come into the forest and understand what they really are. They have been here for a very long time, much longer than humans have walked these lands, and they are lonely in a way, curious about us. They want to know what it feels like to be human, to be bound to flesh and limited by time and space." The calm, matter-of-fact way he described this made my blood run cold. How do you know that? I can hear them more clearly than the rest of you. I think I have always been able to hear them even before I came here. They have been calling to me for years, speaking in my dreams, showing me visions of this forest. That is why I signed up for your course. That is why I needed to come to this specific place. I grabbed his shoulder, forcing him to turn and look at me. Eric, you cannot listen to those voices. Whatever they are promising you, it is not real. They are dangerous. People have disappeared in areas like this. Gone without a trace, never found despite massive search efforts. He smiled at me then, and there was something wrong with his eyes. They reflected the firelight too much, like an animal's eyes, throwing back a cold gleam that human eyes should not produce. I know people have disappeared, Lucen. That is the whole point. They did not vanish. They transformed. They crossed over into something larger than individual human existence, and I want to understand what that means. Before I could respond, before I could try to talk him back to rationality, something happened that changed everything. The voices stopped calling our names. The shapes moving between the trees froze in place. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. A moment of absolute silence descended over the clearing, so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Then, from the darkness directly across the fire from where we sat, a figure emerged. It looked almost human at first glance, roughly the right height and proportions, walking on two legs with a head and arms and the basic structure of a person. But as it moved closer to the firelight, the wrongness became apparent. Its movements were too smooth, too fluid, as if its joints did not work the way human joints should. Its skin had a strange pallor, too pale and somehow translucent, as if you could almost see through to whatever existed underneath. And its face, when the firelight finally illuminated it clearly, was a nightmare. It had features that suggested a human face. Eyes, nose, mouth in approximately the right positions. But the proportions were wrong, the spacing too wide, the angles too sharp. The eyes were too large and completely black, like pools of darkness that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. The mouth was too wide, extending almost to where human ears would be, and when it opened, there were too many teeth arranged in too many rows. "Hello," it said, and its voice was wrong too. Multiple tones speaking simultaneously, creating words through some mechanism that did not involve vocal cords or breath or any normal method of human speech. Sarah screamed, a high, desperate sound that went on and on. David scrambled backward so fast he nearly fell into the fire. Marcus and Jennifer clutched each other, frozen in terror. Amanda had her camera up, pointing at the thing, but her hands were shaking too badly to take a photograph. I forced myself to stand, positioning myself between the entity and the rest of my group. My knife was in my hand, though I had no illusion that a blade would be effective against something like this. "What do you want?" The thing tilted its head, the motion too sharp and precise, like a mechanical gesture rather than a biological one. "Want? We want to understand, to experience, to know what it means to exist in the way you exist. Separate, individual, temporary. You burn so bright and fade so quickly. We have existed for eons, but we have never experienced what you experience in your brief lives." "Then leave us alone," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Observe from a distance if you must, but do not touch us. Do not harm us." "Harm?" The entity made a sound that might have been laughter, a discordant noise that hurt to hear. "We do not wish harm. We wish transformation. Your friend Eric understands. He has been listening to our invitation, and soon he will accept. He will cross the threshold and become part of something infinitely larger than one small human life." I glanced back at Eric. He had stood up now, taking a step toward the entity, his face full of wonder and anticipation. "Eric, no, stay with the group. Whatever this thing is promising you, it is not what you think." But Eric was not listening to me anymore. His attention was completely focused on the entity, and I could see the decision forming in his eyes. He was going to go with it. He was going to walk into that darkness and let whatever was waiting there consume him. "Eric," I shouted, reaching for him, but I was too slow. He took another step, then another, moving away from the fire and toward the entity. It extended one of its two long arms, and Eric reached out to take its hand. The moment they made contact, Eric convulsed violently. His back arched and his mouth opened in a silent scream. Light seemed to pour out of him, not normal light but something else, colors that should not exist and hurt to look at directly. The entity pulled him forward, and they both vanished into the darkness between one heartbeat and the next. Eric was gone, simply gone, as completely as if he had never existed. The forest was silent again. The other shapes had disappeared from between the trees. The oppressive presence that had been surrounding us lifted like fog burning away under morning sun. We sat there in shocked silence for several minutes. Then Amanda started sobbing, huge gasping cries that shook her whole body. Sarah had gone completely pale and looked like she might pass out. Marcus and Jennifer held each other and stared at the spot where Eric had vanished, their faces frozen in expressions of absolute horror. David had curled into a fetal position, unresponsive to anything happening around him. I did not know what to do. I was supposed to be the expert, the guide who kept people safe in the wilderness. But I had just watched one of my students walk away with something that should not exist and disappear into nothing. All my training, all my experience, all my knowledge was completely useless against whatever had just happened. We stayed by the fire until dawn broke at 6:41 a.m. No one slept. No one spoke much. We just sat there, feeding the flames and waiting for enough light to make hiking possible. The forest gradually returned to normal as the sun rose. Birds began singing. Small animals rustled in the underbrush. The stream sounded peaceful again. Everything looked and felt completely ordinary, as if the horror of the previous night had been nothing but a shared nightmare. But Eric was still gone. That was undeniably, impossibly real. We packed up camp in complete silence. No one wanted to talk about what we had witnessed. No one wanted to put into words the absolute impossibility of what had occurred. We hiked back to the trailhead as a group of 5 instead of 6, moving quickly despite our exhaustion, driven by a desperate need to get out of that forest as fast as humanly possible. When we reached the parking lot at 11:30 a.m., I immediately called the authorities on my satellite phone. Within hours, search and rescue teams were organizing, preparing to comb the Whispering Pines region for any sign of Eric. I gave them the GPS coordinates of our camping area and described everything that had happened, though I left out the supernatural elements. I said Eric had wandered away from camp during the night and we had been unable to find him, which was technically true, even if it was not the complete truth. The search lasted for 5 days. They brought in dogs, thermal imaging equipment, helicopters with searchlights. They covered every square mile of the forest within a 10-mile radius of our camp. They checked caves, ravines, streams, anywhere a person might have fallen or sought shelter. They found nothing, no trace of Eric, no footprints, no dropped equipment, no shred of clothing, no indication that he had ever been in that forest at all. It was as if he had simply been erased from existence. The official report listed Eric as lost due to disorientation in unfamiliar wilderness, with a note that the search had been suspended pending any new evidence. They suggested he might have fallen into a ravine or been attacked by a mountain lion, though no remains had been found. Standard explanations for a situation that defied all standard logic. The other members of the group were severely traumatized. Sarah ended up in therapy, suffering from anxiety attacks and nightmares for months afterward. Marcus and Jennifer canceled all their outdoor recreation plans indefinitely. David dropped out of the outdoor program he had been considering and went back to corporate work in the city, as far from wilderness as he could get. Amanda deleted all her wilderness photographs and switched to urban and studio photography exclusively. They all knew what they had experienced, but they also understood that no one would believe them if they told the truth. So they stayed silent, processing their trauma privately, trying to convince themselves it had been some kind of mass hallucination brought on by fear and darkness and isolation. I considered quitting entirely. Eric had vanished under my supervision, taken by something I could not explain or protect against. All my survival knowledge was useless when faced with entities that existed outside normal reality. How could I continue teaching wilderness skills when I knew there were places where those skills meant nothing, where something else was waiting to pull people across a threshold into God knows what kind of existence? But I also felt compelled to understand what had really happened, to research these phenomena, to figure out if there were patterns or warning signs or any way to protect people from whatever existed in certain wilderness areas. So instead of quitting, I changed my approach. I spent the next 6 months researching similar incidents. I found dozens of cases throughout North America and around the world. Areas where people disappeared without explanation, where hikers reported supernatural encounters, where the normal rules of reality seemed to bend. I talked to indigenous elders, retired wilderness guides, paranormal researchers, anyone who might have information about these threshold places. What I learned was both terrifying and enlightening. These locations had existed for as long as humans had been exploring wilderness areas, places where the barrier between our world and something else grew thin, where entities could reach through and make contact with humans. The indigenous peoples had known about them for thousands of years and had developed cultural practices to avoid them or navigate them safely. Modern people, arrogant in their scientific rationalism, dismissed these stories as superstition and folklore, but the disappearances continued happening year after year in the same specific locations. Experienced outdoorsmen vanishing without a trace, hikers reporting encounters with entities that should not exist, groups experiencing mass psychological episodes that traditional science could not explain. The people who vanished were always the ones who engaged with the entities, the ones who listened to the voices calling from the darkness, the ones who tried to communicate or understand. Eric had been listening for years according to what he told me. He had been having dreams about the forest, hearing calls in his sleep. When he finally arrived at the Whispering Pines, he was already halfway across the threshold. The entity just needed to finish pulling him through. Those of us who had resisted, who had stayed terrified and closed off, had survived. Our fear had protected us by making us unwilling to engage with whatever was calling from the darkness. I compiled all this information, tried to publish it in academic journals and outdoor safety publications. Everyone rejected it. Too unscientific, too based on anecdotal evidence, too similar to folklore and superstition to be taken seriously by rational modern people. So I continued teaching wilderness survival, but I was more selective about where I took groups. I avoided areas with documented strange activity. I warned students about certain locations without fully explaining why they should be avoided. And I carried the knowledge that somewhere out there, in certain forgotten corners of the wilderness, things existed that human understanding could not encompass. 4 years passed after Eric disappeared. I relocated my training business to Vermont, far from the Pacific Northwest and the Whispering Pines specifically. I worked with new groups, teaching skills in safer locations, trying to put the trauma behind me. But I could never fully forget what had happened. And part of me, the part that craved understanding over safety, needed to know more. Needed to know if Eric still existed in any meaningful sense, or if he had been destroyed by whatever took him. So I made a decision I knew was probably insane. I decided to go back to the Whispering Pines one more time. Alone this time, without any students to protect. I wanted to try to communicate with whatever entities existed there, to see if I could get answers about what happened to Eric and all the others who had disappeared in places like this. I hiked in during late autumn, almost exactly 4 years after that first terrible trip. The forest looked different in daylight, peaceful and beautiful, with fallen leaves covering the trail and early snow dusting the higher elevations. I reached the clearing where we had camped by mid-afternoon, set up a minimal shelter, and built a fire. As darkness fell, I spoke aloud to the forest. I know you are here. I know you are listening. I came back because I need answers about Eric, about what happened to him and where he went. For hours, nothing happened. The forest remained silent. No voices, no shapes moving between the trees, no sense of the oppressive presence I remembered from before. I began to think that maybe the entities only appeared when there were multiple people to observe, or maybe they were not present at all times. Then, around midnight, I felt the temperature drop suddenly. Frost formed on the ground around my fire. My breath became visible in thick clouds, and I heard the humming again. That deep vibration that seemed to come from the earth itself. From the darkness beyond the firelight, the entity emerged. The same one I had seen before, or something very similar. That almost human shape with wrong proportions and two black eyes. "Lucen," it said in its multi-toned voice. "You returned. We wondered if you would. So few humans come back after witnessing what you witnessed." "I need to know what happened to Eric," I said, forcing my voice to remain steady. "Is he still conscious? Does he still exist in any way that matters?" "He is transformed," the entity said. "His individual consciousness was released from the prison of flesh. He joined with the infinite awareness that flows through all living things. He is part of us now, part of the forest, part of everything." "So he is dead." "Death is a human concept that does not apply to what we are. Eric exists in a form beyond your ability to perceive or understand. He is more than he was before, not less." From the darkness, another figure appeared. This one looked exactly like Eric had looked in life. Same face, same height, same clothing even. But it moved with that same wrong fluidity, and its eyes reflected the firelight in that inhuman way. "Hello, Lucen," it said in Eric's voice. "I am glad you came to understand." Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I forced myself to stay. "Are you really Eric?" "I am what Eric became. The boundaries between individual and collective, between self and other, these are illusions that humans cling to. Here, in the threshold places, those illusions dissolve. I exist as Eric and also as everything else. I am the forest and the soil and the consciousness that moves through all living things." The entity smiled with Eric's face, but the smile was too wide, revealing too many teeth. "You are afraid, just as you were afraid before. But fear is another illusion. What we offer is not destruction but transformation. A release from the prison of individual existence into something infinitely larger." "Why do you need to lure people?" I asked. "Why the voices and the shapes and the fear? Why not just explain what you are plainly?" "Because human minds resist understanding. You have spent millennia building walls around your consciousness, protecting your sense of being separate and individual. We must work around those defenses, speaking in ways that bypass your conscious rejection. The fear you experience is not caused by us. It is your own instinct recognizing that those carefully built walls are under threat." The thing wearing Eric's form moved closer, and I could smell something wrong coming from it. Like decay mixed with flowers, like death and growth happening simultaneously. "We have been patient with you, Lucen. We allowed you to guide others through our territory for years. We understood you needed time to process what you had witnessed. But now you have returned seeking understanding, and we are offering it. The only question is whether you are brave enough to accept transformation." I felt a pull then, a compulsion to say yes, to stand up and walk into the darkness with these entities. Part of me wanted to understand what Eric had experienced. Part of me was desperately curious about what existed beyond the threshold between worlds. But a deeper survival instinct, the primal part of human consciousness that had kept my ancestors alive through countless dangers, knew that this was wrong. These entities might believe they were offering transformation or enlightenment, but from a human perspective, what they offered was death. The destruction of individual consciousness, in favor of being absorbed into some collective awareness. "No," I said firmly. "I do not accept what you are offering. I value my individual existence. I value being lucid, with all the limitations and boundaries that entails." The thing wearing Eric's face tilted its head in that mechanical way. "Then, why did you return? Why call to us if you were not seeking to cross over?" "Because I needed to understand what you are. And now I do. You are predators that feed on consciousness. You dress it up in spiritual language about transformation and collective awareness, but you are just taking people and consuming what makes them individuals." "You misunderstand," it said, but there was something in its tone that suggested I had hit closer to truth than it wanted to admit. But perhaps some humans are too attached to their limitations to see beyond them. "Maybe I am limited," I agreed. "But I would rather be a limited individual than part of your collective, no matter how infinite you claim it to be." The entities began to retreat into the darkness. "You will return, Lucen, eventually. Curiosity will bring you back, or grief or loneliness. All humans return to us eventually. We are patient. We have existed for longer than your species, and we will exist long after the last human has crossed the threshold." "I will not come back," I said, "and I will warn others about what you really are." The laughter echoed through the forest, that not quite human sound. "You already tried that. No one believed you. No one ever believes. The rational mind rejects what the instinctive mind knows to be true, but some will become curious because of your warnings, and they will come seeking, and we will be waiting." They vanished completely, dissolved into shadows. The humming faded away. The temperature returned to normal. The fire burned bright again. I sat there alone for the rest of the night, shaking from adrenaline and fear, but also from a strange sense of clarity. I finally understood what these entities were. Not ghosts or spirits or demons from human mythology. Something older and stranger, existing in the spaces between human understanding and the wild places where consciousness itself seemed to become fluid and uncertain. As dawn broke, I packed up my minimal camp and hiked out of the whispering pines for what I promised myself would be the last time. Behind me, I heard voices calling from the forest, using names I recognized and names I did not. But I ignored them all and kept walking. That was 4 years ago now. I am 34 years old as I tell you this story, still teaching wilderness survival but in safer locations, far from threshold places where reality grows thin. I have learned to identify the warning signs of dangerous areas, and I avoid them completely. But I can never forget what I experienced. I can never look at deep forests the same way again. Every shadow might hide something waiting. Every unexplained sound might be an invitation to cross over into something that will consume your individual existence. I think about Eric constantly. I wonder if any part of him still exists as a separate consciousness, or if he was completely absorbed by those entities. The thing wearing his face claimed he had transformed into something greater, but I choose to believe he is simply gone. His consciousness destroyed, because the alternative is too horrible to contemplate. I am sharing this story now because people need to know the truth. Not everyone will believe me. Most will dismiss this as fiction or the delusions of someone traumatized by a tragic wilderness accident. But there will be a few who recognize the truth in what I am saying. People who have experienced similar things in remote places and did not know how to explain it. This is for those people. You are not crazy. What you experienced was real. There are places in the wilderness where the normal rules of reality do not fully apply. Places where entities exist that want to consume human consciousness in the name of transformation or enlightenment, or whatever they convince themselves they are offering. If you are enjoying this content and want to help spread this warning to others, please hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. Share this video with anyone you know who spends time in remote wilderness areas. This is not entertainment. This is potentially life-saving information. The warning signs are consistent across threshold places, unusual acoustic properties where sounds echo strangely, rapid battery drain in electronic devices, feelings of being watched that intensify in specific locations, animals behaving unusually, time distortions where hours feel like minutes, and most importantly, voices calling from darkness that should not know your name but somehow do. If you encounter these signs, leave immediately. Do not try to investigate or understand. Do not attempt to communicate. Simply mark the location if you can and get out as quickly as possible. Your curiosity is not worth what you might lose by engaging with whatever exists in these places. The forest is still out there. The threshold places still exist, and the entities are still waiting for humans curious enough or desperate enough to answer their calls. I pray you never find yourself in one of these places. But if you do, remember what happened to Eric. Remember that transformation is just another word for consumption. And remember that some thresholds should never be crossed, no matter what promises are whispered from the darkness beyond. Stay safe out there. Trust your deepest instincts. And if you ever hear your name called from a forest where you are alone, do not answer. Just run. Thank you for watching this video all the way through. If this story resonated with you, if it made you remember your own strange experiences in wild places, leave a comment below. I read every single one, and your stories help piece together the larger pattern of what is really happening in the places humans rarely go. The wilderness is beautiful and powerful and worthy of respect, but never forget that in certain locations, something else waits beneath that beauty. Something that wants to pull you across a threshold you can never return from. Be careful out there, and remember, not everything that calls your name wants to help you find your way. Some things just want to make sure you never find your way back.